sharp buzzing of candles and the creaking of massive doors awakened the palace's tranquility as servants, trembling with fear, peered into the chambers of Princess Mary Stuart. The smell of decay, mixed with the pungent odor of opium and herbal ointments, hung over her body. Her clitoris had been cut off, according to the diaries, leaving the princess feeling completely humiliated and in pain that pierced every fiber of her being. The chronicles indicate that every evening, doctors measured her pulse, examined her tongue, checked her urine, and recorded her fever and sweating as her body lost control of its functions with each passing day. Leeches were placed on her thighs and buttocks for a quarter of an hour. Bloodletting was performed twice a day in small portions, and cauterization was performed on her hands and feet to remove toxins. Rumors of palace intrigues even reached her ears. The old nobility tried to dictate the terms of her will. Her new entourage controlled access to her bed, and foreign ambassadors from England and Spain recorded her every move. Every whisper of the servants was perceived as a conspiracy. Someone changed the records of the meals. Someone replaced the seals. Straps on the bed held her body in place. Felt pads were soaked with urine. Cracks on her heels and scabs on her ulcers showed how long she had been suffering. The princess, lying almost motionless, heard whispers about her cut clitoris, about how her body no longer belonged to her. Daily confession became torture. Fear of God's judgment mixed with despair and bitterness. Her thoughts raced between hope for mercy and horror that the new laws of the palace would deprive her of her last right to any power over her own destiny. Every evening, herbal compresses were changed every hour. Opium potions were given in small doses at dawn, and 2 spoonfuls of poppy syrup at night. Rumors that her clitoris had been cut off intensified the fear of those around her. No one dared to come too close, fearing to be infected by the stench and curse that was believed to emanate from the princess's body. Meanwhile, politics continued as usual. Old families tried to extend their reach to power. New ones tried to consolidate their positions, and Princess Maria, even in her emaciated state, watched and sometimes gave orders, noting who would betray her and who would remain loyal. For the first time in many days, she was able to issue a faint order to check the seals on the wine, and at the same time noticed how her body reacted to the cold and heat. Her tongue was dry, her pulse was rapid, and her urine was dark in color. Medical notes recorded every hour, every change. Even the slightest movement of her eyes was noted. Servants spoke of her exhaustion, of how her clitoris and vagina, now deprived of their natural protection, caused her constant pain and burning. Those around her gradually began to realize that the more her body deteriorated, the more strength the princess retained psychologically. She could still see, hear, and feel the betrayal and conspiracy, even when her body was failing. Old documents mentioned she saw how the new council planned to forge her will, but her voice was weak and her body almost immobile. It was these first weeks, when the suffering was just beginning to intensify, that became a stage of preparation for the subsequent degradation, moral, physical, and political. Every day, every procedure, every whisper of the servants formed a picture of relentless agony, where the clitoris and penis, deprived of protection, symbolized not only personal pain, but also the vulnerability of her power, which no one yet dared to take away completely. The body of Princess Mary Stuart continued to undergo a painful transformation, turning into a vessel where every cell screamed in pain. Servants noted in their diaries that the skin around the severed clitoris was inflamed and covered with ulcers, from which a foul-smelling liquid oozed. The moisture seeped through the felt pads, soaking them and leaving stains on the linen sheets. The skin on her heels cracked, causing sharp pain with every movement, and the nails on her hands peeled off, exposing skin covered with small sores and abrasions. Medical reports noted pulse unstable, tongue dry and coated with white, urine dark yellow, sweat sticky and sour smelling, fever fluctuating unpredictably, sometimes rising to 43 degrees, sometimes falling to 37, and the body shaking with chills. Every morning, doctors performed bloodletting in small portions, 1 ounce of blood from the elbow vein, and the same amount from the fingers. Leeches were placed on the inner thighs and buttocks for 15 minutes, and individual ulcers on the arms and legs were cauterized. Ointments made from tar, herbs, and honey were applied 3 times a day. Opium potions were given in small doses at dawn, and 2 spoonfuls of poppy syrup were given before bedtime. Herbal compresses were applied for an hour and changed every 30 minutes. The doctors recorded her pulse, temperature, urine, tongue color, and sweat odor every hour. They noted that by evening, the princess lost consciousness. A wandering spot appeared in her eyes. Her gaze became cloudy, but she still listened to the whispers of her servants, felt their every glance, every step. The political atmosphere surrounding the princess was no less cruel than her suffering. The old nobility reported on her every move, and new courtiers studied notes on procedures to control access to her body and the flow of information. The ambassadors of England and Spain recorded everything: who entered her chambers, who tasted her food, who observed the procedures with opium and poppy syrup. Any interference was considered an interference with her will. Even the slightest mistake by the servants could cause a storm of anger, despite the fact that her body was slowly failing. Daily confession became a ritual of horror. She felt guilt and fear before God while experiencing unrelenting pain. Servants noted that she cried when she spoke of her own clitoris, of being deprived of a part of her body that symbolized her femininity and power. At the same time, Maria's moral strength remained intact. She ordered the palace intrigues to continue to be monitored and dictated changes to her will, even when the voices of her servants seemed treacherous to her, and her face was covered with sweat and pus-filled sores. Over time, hallucinations appeared. The princess heard conversations about herself, even though there were no servants nearby. She saw her supposed enemies planning to seize the throne, cut off the genitals of courtiers, or destroy all those loyal to her. The servants were afraid to come too close to her, sensing the smell of decay emanating from her body. But they continued to carry out her orders, fearing her wrath, even when she lost consciousness from the pain. Her chambers became a place of constant ritual suffering, changing her bedding every hour, cleaning blood and pus, applying ointments, cauterizing ulcers, and making sure no one tampered with the seals on her documents. She struggled to control her weak voice, ordering her servants to check her food again and again to make sure it was safe. Every whisper was like a betrayal, every step a potential threat. The political struggle for power within the palace intensified. Old families tried to gain influence, while her new entourage watched her every move. Ambassadors from England and Spain passed on information about the princess's condition and the palace intrigues, recording notes. The queen, lying on her bed, still gives orders, but her body is mutilated. Her clitoris has been cut off. She holds power only through fear. Her diaries, compiled by servants and secretaries, recorded every step of her decline. The queen's body is covered with sores. Her fever is rising. Her tongue is dry. Her urine is dark, and her pulse is rapid. Despite this, she gives orders, observes, and suspects everyone. Every morning she was given opium, poppy syrup, herbal compresses, bloodletting, and leeches to ease her suffering, but her body continued to decay. During this period, Mary Stuart began to notice that her influence was waning. Although the fear of her remained, those around her began to undermine her will, argue about executions and pardons, and secretly circumvent her instructions. Even at this point, she remained conscious and in control, watching who would betray her and who would remain loyal. Hallucinations mixed with reality. She saw her own clitoris, penis, and vagina in a distorted form, perceiving them as symbols of loss and control over her body and power. Rumors about her condition reached the people. Some sympathized, others feared, believing that the princess was cursed. Her body, every ulcer, every whisper of her servants, became part of a political game where moral decay intensified the fear of her. She continued to participate in decision-making, observing the intrigues and forgeries of the will. By evening, her pulse slowed, her temperature dropped, her tongue became coated, and her eyes clouded over. The doctors wrote, pulse low, fever reduced, skin pale, sores inflamed, odor pungent, sweat sticky. Her body was weakening, but her spirit remained in control. The servants, though afraid, continued to carry out her orders. Each new day brought only more decay and intrigue, making the princess's stay in her chambers unbearable for everyone. Princess Mary Stuart was by this point almost completely immersed in her own suffering, but her mind remained sharp and observant. The skin on her thighs and stomach was covered with new festering sores that oozed a thick yellow liquid with a pungent smell of rot. Servants noted in their diaries that blood and pus soaked the bed. The smell seeped through the doors, causing the guards to hold their breath, and courtiers, approaching, felt the acrid stench and cringed in fear. Even the slightest movement caused sharp pain. Cracks on her heels bled, the skin on her hands peeled off, and the mucous membranes of her genitals, especially in the area of the severed clitoris, became inflamed and often bled, causing incessant itching and burning. Servants recorded every breath, every spasm, every drop of sweat that ran down the princess's body, leaving sticky marks on the linen sheets. Medical procedures now took up most of the day. Bloodletting was repeated twice a day, with every ounce monitored and recorded. Leeches were placed not only on the buttocks and inner thighs, but also on the hands and ankles, with each procedure lasting 15 minutes, followed by cauterization of individual ulcers. Ointments with tar, honey, and herbs were applied every 4 hours, and herbal compresses were applied for an hour, then changed every 30 minutes. Opium was given every morning at dawn in small doses, and 2 spoonfuls of poppy syrup at night. Each dose was recorded in the documents: pulse, temperature, tongue color, urine, sweat odor. Everything was noted, with changes recorded even every half hour. The princess gradually lost the ability to distinguish between day and night. Her hallucinations intensified. She heard whispers accusing her of sins and intrigues, saw her enemies surrounding her bed to take away her power and her own body. She dreamed of regaining her strength and revenge, but the feeling of loss of control and constant pain made these thoughts nothing more than a ghost. Sometimes she saw her own clitoris, the penises of courtiers, and the vaginas of servants in a distorted perspective, symbolizing the power she had lost and was trying to hold on to. At the same time, political struggles intensified. Old families watched her every move, and new courtiers checked records of procedures and changes to her will. Ambassadors from England and Spain recorded who had access to her chambers, who tasted her food, and who participated in procedures involving opium and compresses. Any interference was considered a threat. Her orders and observations were monitored even outside her chambers. Even the princess's weak voice instilled fear. Servants were afraid to approach her, but did not dare to ignore her instructions, recording everything in their diaries. The daily confessions became increasingly intense. The princess repented for her actions, feared God's judgment, and at the same time felt pain from her wounds and her severed clitoris. She begged for mercy for herself and her subjects, discussed executions and pardons, and analyzed intrigues and betrayals. Her voice trembled, but retained its authority. She continued to dictate changes to her will, determining people's fates, even when her body was failing and her eyes were clouding over. Servants noted, "The queen is barely moving, her skin is covered with sores, her pulse is weak, her breathing is labored, but her voice still commands, her eyes follow every step, even when she loses consciousness. Every day was a ritual of pain and control, changing her clothes every few hours, removing blood and pus stains, applying ointments, cauterizing ulcers, checking food and wine. Servants had to record who tasted the food to prevent poisoning or substitution. The decaying body intensified fear and respect. Even the most loyal courtiers tried to stay away, afraid to touch skin that reeked of decomposition. They carried out orders, but secretly circumvented prohibitions, falsified records, and altered test results. Every whisper or step around the bed was perceived as a threat. Princess Mary Stuart still retained the ability to observe, control, and command. Her every move and every word influenced the political situation. Old families fought for influence, new associates tried to manipulate information, and ambassadors recorded every fact. Hallucinations intensified her fear. She saw her own clitoris, the penises of courtiers, and the vaginas of servants as symbols of power and loss, causing her to feel both moral and physical pain at the same time. With each passing day, her condition worsened. Purulent ulcers spread. Her temperature and pulse fluctuated. Cracks on her heels bled, and the ulcers on her hands and face grew larger. The procedures took more and more time. Bloodletting, leeches, cauterization, compresses, opium, and poppy syrup. Everything was recorded, noting changes throughout the day. The servants, despite their fear and disgust, continued to perform the rituals, recording the smallest details for future chronicles. The intrigue reached its peak. The old nobility tried to influence the will, the new entourage looked for weaknesses, and the ambassadors waited for a signal to intervene. Mary Stuart, despite her physical decline, maintained control through fear and observation. She saw everything, the forgery of documents, secret meetings, whispers about her fate. Every movement and every word was recorded, and even in her agonizing death throes, she was able to dictate terms that preserved her influence. Nightly rounds and security meetings became dangerous. The guards were afraid to touch her body, but they were obliged to follow orders. Every whisper in the corridors was perceived as a conspiracy. Servants noted in their diaries, "The queen sees everything, hears everything." Although her body hardly moves, pus and ulcers are spreading. Her clitoris has been cut off, and the pain is unrelenting. Over time, fear of death, God's judgment, and the loss of power became her constant companions. Her body and mind gradually lost synchronization. The pain intensified, and paranoia and hallucinations became continuous. Nevertheless, she was still able to give orders, see intrigues, and observe changes in her surroundings. Every whisper, every glance was perceived as a threat or betrayal. This phase of suffering sets the stage for the final decline, when the body will be almost completely decomposed and Mary Stuart's power will begin to wane, despite her remaining control. Hallucinations, pain, and rituals create an atmosphere of horror in which political intrigue and personal suffering are intertwined to the extreme. Mary Stuart, on the verge of complete physical and mental collapse, gradually lost control of her body. Purulent ulcers on the inner thighs and abdomen grew larger, occasionally oozing a thick liquid with a pungent smell of decay. Traces of blood and pus soaked her underwear, sheets, and felt pads, and the smell spread throughout the rooms, causing the guards and courtiers to hold their breath and approach with caution. Every breath, every convulsive spasm was recorded by servants who kept diaries, noting the details down to the half hour. Medical procedures now took up almost the entire day. Bloodletting was performed twice a day, with every ounce strictly recorded. Leeches were placed on the buttocks, inner thighs, and hands for 15 minutes. Cauterization of the ulcers was repeated several times a day. Ointments made from tar, honey, and herbs were applied every 4 hours. Herbal compresses were changed every 30 minutes. Opium was given in small doses at dawn, and 2 spoonfuls of poppy syrup were given at night. Doctors recorded her pulse, tongue, urine, fever, sweat odor, and the color and condition of her ulcers in detail. The hallucinations became more and more vivid. Maria saw the shadows of courtiers, whispering about betrayal and intrigue, imagining that her clitoris, the penises of the courtiers, and the vaginas of the servants symbolized the power she had lost and was trying to retain. She repented before God, confessed daily, asked for mercy for herself and her subjects, discussed executions and pardons while feeling unrelenting pain. The political struggle reached a critical point. The old nobility tried to dictate the terms of the will, while the new entourage watched her every move, secretly copying down notes about procedures and symptoms. The ambassadors of England and Spain carefully recorded who had access to her chambers, who tasted her food, and who participated in procedures involving opium and compresses. Any interference was considered a threat, and Maria's weak voice instilled fear. Servants, afraid to touch her body, carried out orders, recording everything in their diaries. Night rounds and security meetings became dangerous. The guards were afraid to touch her body, but were obliged to follow orders. Every whisper or step was perceived as a conspiracy. Maria saw everything that was happening around her. Although physically, she could only move her fingers slightly and utter a few words. She controlled the intrigues, watched the secret meetings and whispers of the courtiers, even when her clitoris was cut off and the ulcers spread. With each passing day, her physical suffering intensified. The cracks on her heels bled, the scabs on her sores oozed, the mucous membranes of her genitals became inflamed, and blood mixed with pus. The procedures took longer and longer, and the servants recorded every detail. Maria's orders continued to influence politics, although those around her had already begun to secretly forge her will and orders. Fear of death, God's judgment, and loss of control became her constant companions. Hallucinations and paranoia tormented her. She saw her own clitoris, the penises of courtiers, and the vaginas of servants as symbols of power and loss. Despite her almost complete physical decay, Mary continued to dictate terms, observe changes, and control the political situation. Servants wrote, "The queen barely moves, her skin is covered with sores, her pulse is weak, her breathing is irregular, her clitoris has been cut off, and the pain is unrelenting, but her eyes watch, her voice commands, and everything around her obeys." Hallucinations intensified the feeling of betrayal. Every whisper or step was perceived as a threat, but through her fear, Mary still retained her influence. Days merged into nights. Pain and procedures, hallucinations and political intrigues intertwined. She continued to monitor changes, check records, and see attempts to forge the will and secret negotiations. Despite her physical deterioration, Mary Stuart's influence did not wane, although the fear and disgust of the courtiers grew. With each passing day, the festering sores spread. Her temperature and pulse fluctuated. The cracks on her heels bled, and the scabs fell off. Bloodletting, leeches, cauterization, compresses, ointments, and opium-laced potions occupied the entire day. Servants recorded the slightest changes, noting every breath and convulsion. The intrigue reached its peak. The old nobility tried to dictate the will. The new entourage manipulated information, and ambassadors recorded every fact. The hallucinations intensified. Maria saw her own clitoris, the penises of courtiers, and the vaginas of servants, symbolizing power and loss. Fear of death and God's judgment accompanied her every day. Physical suffering intensified. Paranoia and hallucinations became continuous. She could still give orders, see intrigues, and observe events around her. Every whisper was perceived as a threat or betrayal. This stage sets the stage for the final collapse, when the body will be almost completely destroyed and Mary's power will begin to wane. Hallucinations, pain, and rituals create an atmosphere of horror in which political intrigue and personal suffering are intertwined to the extreme, intensifying the dynamics of suffering and power. The final weeks of Mary Stuart's life turned into a continuous series of pain, fear, and betrayal. Her body was almost completely mutilated, festering sores on her thighs, abdomen, and buttocks spread, cracks on her heels bled, and the mucous membranes of her genitals became inflamed and covered with scabs. Her clitoris was completely cut off, and the pain from the procedure and subsequent infections was accompanied by incessant convulsions. She perceived the penises of servants and the vaginas of courtiers as symbols of power and betrayal. Even in her agony, these hallucinations did not leave her. The procedures took almost the entire day. Bloodletting was performed 3 times a day, with every ounce carefully recorded. Leeches were placed on her buttocks, inner thighs, and hands for 20 minutes at a time. Cauterization was performed on the affected areas, and ointments made of tar, honey, and herbs were applied every 3 hours. Herbal compresses were changed every 15 minutes. Opium was given in small doses at dawn, and poppy syrup was administered 2 spoonfuls before bedtime. Doctors recorded her pulse, temperature, body odor, the color of her sores, and the condition of her urine every day. Those around her were afraid to touch her. Guards, courtiers, and servants approached with caution, many holding their breath so as not to inhale the smell of decay. They rewrote the records of the meals, changed the seals, and made sure that no outsiders had access to her chambers. Secret passages were used to pass orders and control information. But the meetings themselves were often accompanied by whispers and suspicion. The political struggle reached its climax. The old nobility tried to dictate the terms of the will, while the new entourage secretly rewrote the records to seize power. The ambassadors of England and Spain recorded every fact, checked the composition of the guard, and who had access to the Queen. Any mistake could lead to disaster. Mary, though in agony, retained her influence, dictating terms, directing intrigues, and controlling the order of proceedings. Daily confessions became a ritual, not only to ease her conscience, but also to assess the loyalty of her servants. She repented before God, asked for mercy and forgiveness, discussed executions and pardons, while experiencing constant pain from physical injuries. The hallucinations continued to intensify. She saw symbolic bodies, clitoris, penis, and vagina as manifestations of power, betrayal, and loss of control. The nights were especially difficult. The convulsions and pain intensified, and the hallucinations became almost constant. Any movement, whisper, or step was perceived as a conspiracy. She could barely move her fingers, but she could still command or direct the actions of her courtiers. The fear and disgust of those around her were combined with their obedience. In her final days, Maria almost completely lost her sight and hearing. Her body did not obey her, and her voice became intermittent. Despite this, she tried to control the political situation, direct the preparation of her will, and observe the courtiers and their actions. Her agony was at its peak. Her body was almost completely destroyed, and her consciousness held on to the remnants of her power. Death came after a long agony. The last day was recorded in the diaries of her servants. The queen did not raise her head. Her pulse could not be felt. Her breathing was intermittent. Her body was emaciated. Her clitoris was completely cut off, and she hallucinated seeing the penises and vaginas of her courtiers, but her eyes still followed them. After her death, the courtiers recorded all the changes with horror. The sheets were soaked with blood, the chambers reeked of decay, and the body was difficult to remove for embalming. The consequences for the authorities and society were immediate. The old nobility tried to use Mary's death to strengthen their influence, while the new entourage sought to consolidate their positions. The will was forged, and the intrigues intensified. The people, priests, and foreign ambassadors, seeing signs of a violent agony, were shocked. Many lost faith in the monarchy. Religious fears intensified, and the struggle for the throne entered an open phase. Court reports described, after the queen's death, her chambers reek of a foul odor. Servants are afraid to enter. The will has been altered. The old nobility and the new entourage are in conflict, and foreign ambassadors are watching with concern. Later medical treatises noted, the body shows complete decay. Ulcers and inflammation spread throughout the entire room. The clitoris and other organs were mutilated, which intensified the pain. Mary Stuart's death led to a shift in politics and society. Power passed to new players, old families lost influence, and foreign states increased pressure. Religious and political fears intertwined with the horror of her agonizing death. Her suffering, hallucinations, and cruel medical procedures became the subject of chronicles, diaries, and archival reports, leaving behind memories of her painful demise and fear of injustice and betrayal.